Hello, everyone. I thought I would do a review and an analysis of The Crucible by Arthur Miller. Now, the reason why I've been reading The Crucible lately, even though I did originally read it in high school, is because I'm writing a story that's currently set in Puritan New England. So I wanted to read some things that had that kind of tone and flavor to them. I've already read The Scarlet Letter, and and so I wanted to revisit The Crucible for that reason. Even though when I did read The Crucible in high school, I actually read it not alone. It was done through group readings where you would be assigned a part and you would have to read it aloud. And I was actually assigned the part of Judge Danforth, who I actually believe has the best dialogue and has the best role and the most interesting role, that is, in the whole play. He's the head judge. Most of the time when I was assigned readings in school, if I had to do a part, it wasn't a part that I wanted. But in that case, I would have chosen Danforth if I hadn't already been picked for it. And I also will say that later this year, I actually will be vacationing in October. Hopefully, if things don't go wrong, I will be going to a lot of places in Puritan New England. I'll be visiting Concord, Massachusetts, and Pittsfield, Massachusetts, and some old Puritan houses in New Hampshire and Kennebunkport in Maine. Unfortunately, I'm not going to get to go to Salem this time. I wish I were, but I'm not in charge of it. But the reason is that my father really doesn't want to go because it's crowded in October, that time of year. The only thing I really want to see there is the House of Seven Gables. I have been to Salem before, though, but I was 11 years old. But unfortunately, I'm not going to get to go. But here's the thing: is if the way that the trip is lined up, if I went on that day, um, I wouldn't get to go to Pittsfield to the Herman Melville Museum, and I really want to do that. And so that's going to be the highlight of my trip, hopefully. But I will be going to a lot of places with Puritan New England architecture, and hopefully I can take some pictures later that I may use at least parts of in a cover whenever I finish The Disappearance of Richard Blackwood. But I just thought I would get that in. But anyway, no, The Crucible is essentially about how a society can succumb to conformity and to groupthink, how people can throw their rationality out the window in favor of not just superstition, but social pressure. And that's something that all societies can fall victim to that. The threat might change. It might not always be a witch. Sometimes it might be, and of course, Arthur Miller wrote the Crucible in the 50s, where communism was the main threat. And or even now you have situations where people are, let's say, accused of sexual abuses, which always should be taken seriously. But at the same time, people can become so paranoid that they end up accusing everyone of such things, or believing people without evidence, and then the idea that we are above succumbing to the crucible mindset is simply not true. Who we hate might change, is the boogeyman who might change, but in terms of that mentality, that groupthink, the mentality, that conformity mentality, that's something that is just innate within human nature. And so if you think you're immune to it, you're definitely not. Um, and so, anyway, The Crucible, though, obviously is about the character of John Proctor, who is incensed when people start being accused of, because it all starts when essentially there's not enough time to go through the whole thing, but essentially when they catch girls dancing in the woods, and then they don't want to get in trouble, so they start acting sick. And then people think, obviously, that it's witchcraft. And then Abigail Williams takes advantage of this in order to get revenge on John Proctor, who she had an affair with, but then he forced her out of her house, so she wants to get revenge on him by getting, his wife condemned and all of that. And so it shows, though, how political it was, and how a lot of some of these judges did things more out of political expediency, than actually sincere beliefs around witchcraft. In actual fact, one of the people who I think sincerely believed and was doing things really for the sake of justice was Reverend Hale, who I actually think is one of the most interesting characters because he changes, I think, the most because he instigates a lot of it at the beginning because he thinks there actually is witchcraft in Salem. But later on, he sees that Abigail Williams is just using witchcraft as an excuse to get revenge, but he's the only one who sees it, and he feels terrible that he was responsible for getting people interested in the trials, but now he realizes that he made a huge mistake and he can't take it back. And so I would consider him probably one of the only good and honest men who originally was a persecutor who changed his mind, but all the others are purely out mostly for either self-gain or for their own pious sense of righteousness. And of course, it all comes to a head at the end of the play when John Proctor is convicted of witchcraft, and he has to, and they force him to sign, and they force him to sign a document confessing it. But then he says he doesn't want that to be record to be public because he values his name. But they say, oh, we need good and legal proof of this. So ultimately, he ends up tearing it up, and he says he basically chooses his honor and dignity over his own life, and that's one of the things that the Crucible is about. It's about honor and dignity, and how one will not forfeit their own soul for dishonor, and how one will give up even their own life if that means keeping their honor. And so it's a very powerful play in that regard, and I especially love how Miller uses the period dialogue and how he really steeps himself into the time period, and how one of my favorite probably speeches and monologues from the Crucible is when Danforth says, we are no longer in the dusky afternoon between evil and where there's shadows and gray between, this is not the exact quote, between good and evil, but now the sun is up, and those who aren't afraid can step into the light. And so to me, there's a lot of heightened dialogue in this that is very Shakespearean, which of course the Crucible took place just a few decades after Shakespeare's death, so it makes sense. And so it has the heightened language is very enjoyable. And you have the character of Danforth, though, who's especially interesting because he's you could tell at various times that he could be pulled towards siding with John Proctor, but he's ultimately, because of his own pride and hubris, is manipulated to go against John Proctor. And so he's a very interesting character. In fact, I've always thought that if I were John Proctor or someone similar who was accused of witchcraft, because they use this thing of spectral evidence, which is ultimately inadmissible evidence, because spectral evidence was essentially, you would accuse someone of being a witch, but because you were the only one who could see it because it was spectral, their testimony didn't matter, only what you said mattered. But which obviously is not a proper way of assessing evidence because it's unfalsifiable. But again, the Crucible deals with this idea that people value emotion and their own preconceptions over truth and evidence. But in this case, I would have said, if I were John Proctor, I would have said, when they said, did you see someone with the devil? Yeah, I saw someone with the devil. I saw you, Judge, with the devil, this whole court with the devil. The devil has, I saw him whisper in all of your ears to try to stir paranoia in the countryside. Now, that would be a very interesting defense because they would hang me anyway, but at least I would stump them because the court would either have to, logically, they would either have to believe me, since my testimony is the only testimony that matters because you can't disprove what I say, or they would have to consider spectral evidence inadmissible. But if they did that, then they would have to free everyone who had been convicted. And so to me, that's a defense that nobody tried. But I would try if I were actually involved in these witch trials. But the Crucible overall is a story about how a society can descend into conformity and madness because no one is willing to actually stand up for the truth. So that is my review of The Crucible.